Montana Territory, August 1882. The sun had barely cleared the edge of the eastern ridge when the whispers started again, slipping through the dry grass and past the broken fence lines of Willow Creek, like they had somewhere to be. They said she would die alone for her shame. Whitney Sutton kept her chin high as she stepped off the stagecoach, skirts dusty, boots cracked, and her arms wrapped tightly around a worn carpetbag. Her face was drawn but calm, like a woman who had already faced the worst and found herself still breathing. A year ago, she'd left this town pregnant and disgraced, her father's name spat from doorways, her own face turned from church pews. She'd walked out with nothing but a swollen belly and a letter from the man who'd promised her forever and vanished before spring. She came back with nothing but silence and a baby grave carved into cold Dakota earth. She didn't look at the women peering from behind curtains or the men who stepped aside like her touch might stain. She just walked. Past the saloon, past the mill, past the place her father had been buried without her last year. She stopped at the edge of the land that used to be hers and dropped her bag in the dirt. The house was gone. Torn down, burned or rotted, she didn't know. She just stared at the scorched posts, the stones where the hearth used to be. "You plan to live in the wind," the voice came from behind her, low and steady. She turned slow and saw a man leaning against the frame of a wagon hitched to a mule. He was tall, sunburned, with a rough beard and eyes the color of the river after rain. He looked young, maybe 30, but tired in the way men got after too many years alone. "I plan to live," she said. He nodded once and looked past her to the ridge. "You're Whitney Sutton." She didn't flinch. "And you, Hayes Granger." He said nothing else, just walked to the back of the wagon and pulled down a bundle of lumber, dropping it near the broken foundation like it belonged there. "I didn't order anything." "You didn't have to." He looked at the land again, then at her. "This used to be your family's. Figured it still ought to be." She narrowed her eyes. "Why do you care?" He didn't answer. Just grabbed a hammer from the wagon and started measuring the posts. She watched him for a while. He worked quiet, hands steady, movements sure. By dusk, he had half the floor laid down and a small fire going near the edge of the clearing. She hadn't said more than 10 words all day, but when he passed her a tin cup of coffee, she took it. "You gonna build a house?" she asked. "No." She looked at the boards, confused. "Then what are you building?" He met her eyes across the fire. "A porch." She stared at him. He didn't look away. "Figured you'd need somewhere to sit when the world gets too loud." She didn't speak for a long time. Then softly, "They all said I'd die alone. Then they don't know you." The fire cracked between them. She looked down, fingers tight around the cup. "I had a daughter," she said, voice barely above the wind. "Her name was Clara." Hayes didn't say anything. He just nodded once, like he was folding the name into his chest forever. "She died in January." Her voice broke. "I was alone. Nobody came." "I am here now," he said. She looked at him, really looked at him. There was something about the way he sat like he had nowhere else to be. Like the world turned and he stayed still. And for the first time in months, her hands stopped shaking. 2 days passed. Hayes built the porch, board by board, without asking for thanks. Whitney cleared the weeds, swept the dirt, cooked simple meals over the fire. At night, they sat on that porch, side by side. Sometimes they talked about the land, about the world, about nothing at all. Sometimes they just listened to the crickets and the wind. On the third night, he handed her a piece of paper. It was a drawing, rough and penciled, of a small cabin with a wide porch and a chimney that smoked. "I could help you build it," he said. "If you want it." She stared at the drawing, her throat tight. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. He looked at her with something quiet and steady in his eyes. "Because you came back when you could have stayed gone. Because you buried your child and kept walking. Because you are not shame, Whitney. You are strength." She blinked hard, tears forming. "You do not even know me." "I am trying to." A week passed. Then, too, the house started to take shape. He brought lumber, she brought bread. He built walls, she planted herbs. They laughed once, just once, over a crooked window frame, and the sound startled both of them. One morning she found him sitting on the porch before dawn, staring out at the trees. She brought him coffee and sat beside him. "When my mother died, I was 12, he said. "My father was a drunk. I figured I would grow up alone. I did not think I would still be alive at 31. She watched his profile in the half-dark. "Do you want to be alone?" He turned then, looked at her. "Not anymore." She didn't answer. Just reached out slowly and rested her hand on top of his. He closed his fingers around hers like he had been waiting for it. Later that evening, he brought her a chair he had carved himself. Simple, strong, with her initials burned into the back. She touched it like it was gold. "I do not have much to offer," she whispered. "You are here. That is everything." They watched the sun dip behind the ridge from the porch that night, her head resting on his shoulder, his hand around hers. And for the first time since Clara died, she let herself breathe without pain. They said she would die alone for her shame. But the cowboy built a porch and sat there forever. August rolled into September with a slow hush that settled over the hills like a quilt. The light changed more gold than white now, and the cottonwoods along the creek began to yellow at their edges. Whitney's hands, once raw from labor, had grown sure again. She moved through each day with a quiet rhythm, splitting kindling before sunup, tending the beans and squash she'd planted along the slope, sewing by lantern light when the sky turned black. Hayes came each morning just as the mist lifted off the grass, carrying nails wrapped in canvas or a sack of oats slung over one shoulder. He never asked her what she wanted built next. He just watched the land and her place on it and seemed to know. One afternoon, she found him shaping wood beside the half-framed chimney. His shirt was damp along the collar, sleeves rolled to the elbow. He didn't speak right away, only glanced up and nodded toward a small crate beside his boots. "I stopped at the general store," he said, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "They had a few things left from the order that came through Helena." Whitney knelt beside the crate and lifted the lid. Inside were 4 panes of glass, wrapped in straw and a slender iron latch. She traced the edge of one pane with her fingertip. "I didn't think I'd ever have windows again," she said. "You will now." She didn't thank him. Instead, she stood and looked at the frame of the house walls still bare, roof only half laid, and said, "There ought to be a room for books." "Just a small one." He set down the plane and crossed his arms. "You read much." "I used to, before." "What kind?" "Histories, natural studies, poetry sometimes." She hesitated, then glanced at him. "Do you, when I can find something worth reading?" He leaned against the porch post. "There was a man at Fort Ellis, used to keep a shelf of old volumes. I read one about rivers. Said the Missouri starts as snowmelt and it don't look like much at first, just trickles. But it carves the whole land given time." Whitney smiled, faint and fleeting. "That sounds like poetry to me." He shrugged with one shoulder. "Maybe it is." That night she brought out the only book she had left its spine cracked and leather faded from years of travel. She handed it to him without a word. He took it carefully, turned the pages like they might split. "I read this to Clara," she said, voice low. "She liked the parts about birds." Hayes didn't speak, just opened to the marked page and read aloud by firelight, his voice steady as creek water. When he finished, he closed the book and gave it back without looking away. "She sounds like she was brave." Whitney folded the book against her chest. "She was." A few days later, rain came. Not a storm, but a soft, soaking kind that made the earth smell like pine and turned the creek clear again. The house frame stood open to the sky, and they worked beneath canvas tarps, laying floorboards and securing beams. She didn't mind the wet. It reminded her of the spring she left, how the world had seemed to wash itself clean even as she fell apart. When the rain eased, they sat under the overhang of the porch, sharing bread and boiled potatoes. She passed him the last piece, and he took it without fuss. "Do you miss the army?" she asked. He chewed slowly. "Not the fighting." "Not the silence afterward, neither." "What then?" He studied the trees for a long moment before answering. There was a rhythm to it. "You knew what came next, even if it was hard. Out here it's different. Things shift." She nodded, her fingers curling around the tin cup in her lap. I used to think if I followed all the rules, life would turn out the way I wanted, but it didn't. Maybe it never does. She looked over at him. And what about now? What do you want? He didn't look at her this time, just leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I want to finish this house. I want to see winter come with smoke rising from that chimney, and I'd like to sit on that porch with someone who knows what it means to lose and keep going anyway. Whitney didn't speak. The fire cracked behind them, soft and warm against the damp air. She leaned her shoulder into his, just enough to feel the weight of him beside her. He didn't move away. That night she dreamed of a table set for two, a shelf of books by the window, and a door that always opened at dusk. And when she woke, Hayes was already outside, hammer in hand, building it. By late September, the roof was on. The last shingles had gone up beneath a sky the color of slate, clouds dragging low over the mountains. The chill in the air pressed close, enough to make breath visible by morning. Hayes moved slower now, not from fatigue, but with the measured care of a man who knew the weight of permanence. Every board he placed was meant to hold through snow and time. Whitney had taken to rising before first light, folding her hair beneath a wrapped scarf, hands wrapped in wool she'd stitched herself. She kept her tools in a basket now. Needle, thread, strips of muslin, a tin of wax, the small comforts of a woman reclaiming a home from nothing. That afternoon, as she stood fitting a curtain rod above the kitchen window, she caught sight of Hayes outside, holding a length of cedar. He was studying it like it had something to say. She stepped down from the stool and opened the door. "You're staring at that plank like it offended you," he turned, eyes thoughtful. "Just thinking where it ought to go, inside or out." Neither was thinking of carving it. She brushed sawdust from her dress. "For what?" He ran his thumb along the grain. "Nameplate." "For the house." She hesitated in the doorway. "It doesn't have a name." "Maybe it ought to." He set the cedar aside and looked at her square. "You decide." She stepped out then, arms crossed against the wind. "It doesn't feel right to name it before I know if it'll last." He nodded once, then picked up his tools without pushing. The next day she found him down by the creek, sleeves rolled, trousers damp to the knee. He was laying stones in a half circle, water glinting over his hands. She crouched nearby, quiet, watching the shape take form. "What's it for?" she asked. "Was thinking you'd want a place to wash linens." She tilted her head. "And you thought of that on your own," he kept working, voice even. "You've been boiling water every third day. Figured this'd save you from hauling so much." Whitney sat on a flat rock, watching the current shift over his work. "You notice more than most." He paused, then met her eyes. "You don't hide much when you think nobody's looking." She smiled just once, faint and crooked, then looked away toward the tree line. "My mother used to sing while she worked, always something with a river in it." Her voice softened. "I didn't think I'd ever hear water like this again without feeling like I was drowning in it." "You're not drowning now," he said. "No, I'm not." She picked up a pebble, turned it in her palm. "But I still don't know what comes next." "You don't have to yet." A hawk called overhead, wheeling against the sky. She watched it pass, then stood. "Hayes." He looked up. "I want to call it Clara's house." He nodded once, not asking for more. The stonework was finished by dusk, and she brought him broth with turnips and barley. They ate on the porch, not saying much. He passed her a folded scrap of paper, the cedar nameplate sketched out in soft pencil strokes. She ran her thumb along the edge. "You'll carve it, if you want it," she nodded. That night she stayed seated long after the sun dipped behind the ridge. Hayes didn't rise either. The wind had picked up. Leaves rustled against the steps. "I used to think about what it would be like to be wanted again," she said. He looked at her but didn't speak. "Not for what I was before or what I failed at." She looked down at her hands. "Just for what I am now." He reached across the space between them, slow and sure, and laid his hand over hers. "You are not a failure, Whitney." Her throat tightened. "How do you know?" "Because I've seen men who gave up when the world turned ugly." "You didn't." She turned her hand over, lacing her fingers with his. They sat like that until the fire in the hearth inside burned low. She didn't pull away, and he didn't let go. The porch creaked once beneath them, quiet as breath. In the morning, the nameplate was carved. Simple script, clean lines. He nailed it above the door without a word. And when she opened that door later, stepping into the quiet warmth of the house they'd built together, she didn't feel alone anymore. By the first frost, smoke curled steady from the chimney, and the house had taken on the scent of pine and hearth ash. Hayes added a second latch to the door before the wind came down from the hills, and Whitney lined the windows with wool scraps to keep the cold from slipping through. Nothing about the place was grand, but it held warmth, and that was more than she'd had in years. One morning before sunup, she found him at the edge of the clearing with his coat collar turned up and a canvas sack slung over his shoulder. "Going somewhere?" she asked, voice low from sleep. He looked over, surprised to see her awake. "Old man Dalton's mare foaled last night." He sent word through the boy at the mill. She stepped closer, pulling her shawl tight. "That's 2 ridings in 1 week. Dalton's near 70. Can't lift a fence rail anymore, let alone handle a breech berth." He shifted the sack. "I'll be back before dusk." She nodded once, then reached into her pocket. "Take this." She pressed a wrapped biscuit into his hand. "It's still warm." He paused, looking down at the cloth bundle. "You didn't have to, I know." The horse snorted behind him, impatient. He swung up and tipped his hat just slightly before turning toward the trail. She watched until the trees swallowed him, then stepped back inside to stoke the fire and set the kettle. Dusk came slower than usual, and though she kept her hands busy, her ears stayed tuned to every sound from the ridge. When hoofbeats finally reached the porch, she stepped out with a lantern. Hayes dismounted stiffly, his coat streaked with dried mud. "She lived," he said before she could ask. "Colt came out long ways, but we managed." She took the reins and led the horse toward the lean-to. "You hungry? Could eat." Inside, she set stew on the coals and ladled it into 2 bowls. They ate without rush. His hands were scraped raw from the work, and she passed him a cloth soaked in vinegar water. "Dalton offer you money?" she asked. He nodded. "Wouldn't take it. You should have. Didn't build this place to need coin." He glanced around the room, then met her eyes. "Built it to last." Later, she folded a blanket over his shoulders as he sat near the hearth. Her fingers brushed his neck, and he stilled. "Your hands are cold," he said quietly. She didn't pull away. "Yours are worse." He turned then, just enough to see her face in the firelight. "You ever think about leaving again?" She shook her head. "No, I left once. Nothing good came of it." He studied her, eyes softer than she'd ever seen. "I don't want you to." "I don't want to," she said. The wind rose outside, brushing snow against the shutters. She knelt beside him, the floor warm from the fire. "I want chickens come spring," she said, "and maybe a goat. You thinking of trading for one?" "No," she leaned her shoulder against his. "Thinking of raising it." They sat like that a long while, fire crackling low. When she finally rose, he reached for her hand. "Come morning," he said, "I'll start the fence." She laced her fingers through his. "You always know what's next," he smiled, tired and quiet. "Only with you." Snow fell steady that night. The house held firm. And for the first time in her life, Whitney Sutton slept without looking toward the door. By late October, the first real snow came heavy and wet, blanketing the slopes and hushing the world to stillness. The fence Hayes built ringed the back pasture now, thick posts sunk deep into frozen ground. A neighbor boy brought over 2 hens, and a lean, speckled rooster in trade for a wool scarf Whitney had woven. They kept close to the coop Hayes had built beside the shed, scratching at the straw like they belonged. Hayes had taken to sleeping on a cot by the hearth, claiming it was warmer than the lean-to, though neither of them said out loud that the house had become his just as much as hers. He rose early, split wood, checked traps along the creek. She canned apples in the root cellar, sewed extra quilts, and started reading again by lantern light in the evenings. They moved around each other like a pair long settled, though nothing had been spoken clear. One night, after a steady day of snow and quiet, she found him outside, leaning against the porch post, lantern at his feet. The air was sharp, the moon casting pale light over the white yard. "You'll catch cold," she said, stepping out beside him. I like the quiet, he answered, not turning. She watched him a moment, then stepped closer until their shoulders touched. I got a letter today, she said. He looked over, eyebrows raised. From my aunt in Wisconsin. She offered to take me in. She paused. Says there's work at the boarding house where she cooks. A school nearby. Hayes didn't speak. His jaw tensed slightly, but his voice stayed level. You thinking of going? No. He looked at her fully then, eyes steady. She's kind enough, Whitney said, but she doesn't know me anymore, not really. And I'm not the girl who left here 2 years ago. Hayes nodded once. You're not. I want to stay. She turned to face him, not for the house or the land, for what it feels like now, his breath clouded in the cold. I've been waiting, Whitney, he said, voice low. But I need to know if I'm still waiting. She reached up, gloved hand brushing his cheek. You're not. He leaned into her touch like he'd been holding still too long. She rose to her toes and he met her halfway. The kiss was slow, grounded, the kind that settled deep and didn't ask for proof. When they parted, she rested her forehead against his. I want a life, not just a roof, she whispered. You'll have it, he said, if you'll have me in it. That night he didn't return to the cot. They lay together beneath the wool quilts, snow tapping soft against the shutters. She curled close, his arm wrapped around her shoulders, her breath warm beneath his chin. Neither of them spoke of what came next. They didn't have to. By late November, the hens had laid their first eggs and Hayes brought home a goat from the mill foreman, traded for 2 cords of firewood. They named her Alice, and she followed Whitney around the yard like a shadow. On Sundays, they took long walks past the ridge, Hayes pointing out tracks in the snow, Whitney naming plants that still clung to the earth. They spoke of spring in quiet tones, rows of carrots, a second coop, maybe a plank table built by Hayes's own hands. That winter, the house held more than warmth. It held laughter, quiet understanding, and a rhythm that never needed permission. Hayes carved a bookshelf for the reading room, and Whitney filled it slowly with second-hand volumes from passing traders. She wrote Clara's name on the first page of each one. In early December, they rode into town, coats buttoned tight, hands joined beneath the sleigh blanket. The preacher met them in the back room of the chapel. There were no flowers, no pews filled, just 2 witnesses and a worn Bible. But when Hayes lifted her veil and whispered her name like it was something sacred, Whitney felt a stillness settle inside her, soft and certain. They returned home with the sun dipping low behind the ridge. Hayes carried her across the threshold of Clara's house, laughing when she kicked snow from his boots before he could step inside. That night, they danced slow to the sound of the fire, their shadows long on the walls. Years passed and the house held strong. They planted an orchard, raised goats and hens, built chairs for neighbors, and shared bread with travelers. Each spring brought new growth, each winter a deeper kind of peace. They spoke of Clara often, not as sorrow, but as a seed that had brought them to this place. One summer, a small girl with Hayes's eyes and Whitney's quiet strength took her first steps on the porch her father built. When she tumbled, Hayes caught her. Whitney laughed, lifting the child into her arms, the 3 of them framed in the afternoon light. They named her June. And every evening, when the sun dipped behind the ridge, Hayes and Whitney sat side by side on that porch, fingers laced, hearts full, and watched the light stretch long across the land they'd made into home.